Hey everybody. So in this video, we're going to be talking about natural selection. We're going to talk about three principles that drive and allow natural selection. So again, what is natural selection? Natural selection is the process of evolution whereby the traits that move into the next generation are largely determined by which traits allow the organism to survive. All right. Now, what are the principles that allow natural selection to choose those traits? Well, let's I'm going to share my screen with you so you can follow along with my list here. All right. Now, first, let me specify that every now and then I might say something like natural selection chooses or sexual selection chooses. You should never assume that I mean that there is this force, there is this entity of natural selection that's doing any kind of choosing, because that's not what's happening. All right, really, we're just talking in these terms because it's easier. All right, so let's talk about the three processes, the three aspects of natural selection that allow it to shape what traits move into the next generation. So first, variation. Every animal on the planet, in every species on the planet, varies. All right. With humans, we vary in height, hair color, eye color, breadth of shoulder. We vary in every dimension. All right. We even vary in how many genetic mutations we have. We probably all have some few genetic mutations. Now, these genetic mutations can be and are important for the evolutionary process. We typically think about genetic mutations as a bad thing, all right? However, well, and with good reason, because the genetic mutations that we usually hear about are the ones that are harmful. But the majority of genetic mutations are unnoticeable because they don't do much of anything, all right? They're usually causing some very small, largely unnoticeable tweak to some process, sometimes some behavior, something in our physical makeup. Now, our brain is a physical entity, all right? It's an organ, just like our heart is or our stomach is, all right? And in the same way that a genetic mutation can tweak maybe some part of how our stomach or heart works, a genetic mutation can tweak some small part of how our brain works. And in that way, those genetic mutations can cause changes in behavior. Now, one criticism that I've heard is from people saying, well, genetic mutations only cause bad things. Well, this could not be further from the truth. Right? This could not be further from the truth. Genetic mutations, like I said, most of them do almost nothing. But certainly, sometimes genetic mutations can be very beneficial. For example, there is one genetic mutation that right now we only know to occur in about 1% of the Caucasian population that makes them functionally immune to the HIV virus. All right. So essentially, there's a genetic mutation that changes the shape of their cells' receptors, and so the HIV virus, the human immunodeficiency virus, can't attach to the cells, and so it can never infect them. So they can have HIV and never know it, never suffer any problems from it. All right, they are functionally immune to HIV/AIDS. All right, so that's a genetic mutation. All right, that's the result of a genetic mutation. Yes, genetic mutations can be beneficial. There was an Olympic skier that had a genetic mutation that allowed his lungs to process oxygen more efficiently. There have been numerous mutations in the laboratory, man-made mutations, but the man-made mutations in the mutations in the laboratory were man-made, but these mutations had beneficial consequences for the animals that had them when they were now, obviously, not all genetic mutations are beneficial, as I've already said, but they can be. Again, I'll reiterate this for the third time, most mutations aren't even noticeable, but some can be beneficial, all right? And we all vary in how many of these mutations we have. If these mutations cause some kind of beneficial consequence, then that beneficial consequence may then be passed on to the next generation. But we'll come back to that piece in a little bit. So we all vary in every way, okay? And this is true of every organism and every trait, okay? None of us are carbon copies. Now, the second principle of natural selection is inheritance, all right? And that simply refers to the fact that genetically based qualities and traits are the ones that get passed on to the next generation. If it's a trait that is not genetically based, it won't move on. So all the things that you're learning in class, those are not genetically based. Your knowledge of psychology is not a genetically based trait, all right? And so it will not be passed on to the next generation through the process of natural selection, all right? You can teach your kids that information, but then that trait of your knowledge, your hopefully developing expertise in psychology, that's not going to pass on because it's not genetically based. But those genetic mutations that we talked about earlier, because they're a mutation of the gene code, they can be passed on. So we've got variation. We all vary in every way, including our genetic mutations. We can inherit genetically based traits, all right? And then if those traits provide some advantage in terms of natural selection, if they help the organism to survive longer, all right, then they are said to be selected for. Because if they allow the organism to survive longer, then that longer lived organism is going to have more opportunities to reproduce, all right, and therefore have the potential of having more children. Now, if that mutation, let's say, helps them live longer but doesn't help them reproduce anymore, then it won't be selected for. Because again, if you go back to the last video that I posted about where I was introducing evolutionary theory, evolution works through reproduction. So if a trait doesn't help an organism to reproduce, then it's not going to help, it's not going to be selected for. Because again, natural selection is all about what the process by which traits move from one generation to the next. If there is no reproduction, if there's no creation of the next generation, then those traits can't move to the next generation, all right? So those are the three principles of natural selection. And those are the three mechanisms that allow the environment to shape the traits that go on to the next generation. So let's think about this, right? If we have an environment of big trees, lush vegetation, food, rich source of nutrients in the form of fruits growing from those trees, but not much in the way of food on the ground, then organisms that have mutations or traits that make it easier for them to get up into the trees and get those nutrient-rich sources, they're going to, if those traits that allow them to do that are genetically based, then they're going to live longer because they have more access to food. They're going to live longer. Because they live longer, they're going to have more access to mates. They're going to simply by the long game, right? The longer they live, the more chances they're going to have to reproduce. Put very simply, an organism that lives 1 year isn't going to have nearly as many chances to reproduce as an organism that lives 5 years, right? The organism that lives 5 years is going to have 5 times as many, on average, chances to reproduce as the one, all right? Now, all other things being equal, the organism that lives 1 year is going to have 5 times fewer chances to reproduce than the organism that lives 5 years. So if this trait allows them to get up into the trees easier, get access to that food easier, they're going to live longer, all right? So that variation, those traits that allow them to do that, get up in those trees easier, get that food easier, all right? Those traits are going to allow them to live longer than other members of the same species that don't have those traits or don't have them to the same extent. So those organisms can't climb up in the trees as easy. They can't eat the food as easy. We see this in birds constantly, all right? Birds, over time, the shapes of their beaks will change. It'll change because it changes to match whatever's in whatever food's available in the environment. If they're having to do some pecking to find food, like seeds or something, then they'll have a different shape. If they're having to crack like shells or the shells of certain animals, then they'll have a different shaped beak. All right. Why? Well, the birds that have the mutation that causes their beak shape to change, those birds with that mutation, they're gonna be able to eat more easily. Because they eat more, they live longer. All right. Because they live longer, they have more chances to reproduce. If their beak shape is due to a genetic mutation or a genetic variation, which it usually is, but certainly there are aspects of the environment that can cause abnormalities and can reshape the beak. As long as, if that mutation reshapes the beak in a beneficial way, cool. The organism will live longer, reproduce more, provided the trait doesn't somehow keep them from reproducing. All right. They'll live longer, they'll reproduce more. Because they reproduce more, they'll have more kids. Their kids will have that trait. So there'll be more people, more organisms in the next generation, more birds in the next batch of eggs that have that beak. If we go back to the trees, lush vegetation and fruit in the trees example, the organisms with the variations that allow them to climb in the trees and get the fruit and eat more, because they live longer, they're going to have more chances to reproduce. So there's going to be more children in the next generation with their traits, with their ability to get up into the trees and get that fruit. Whereas the organisms that didn't, all right, who didn't have those traits that allow them to get up in the trees and get the fruit, they're not going to live as long, so they're not going to have as many kids, and so they're not going to have as many offspring, and so there's not going to be as many offspring in the next generation with their lack of the beneficial traits. Over many, many generations, as that goes on, that just compounds itself. So the number of organisms that have the beneficial traits grows, and the number of organisms that don't have that beneficial trait shrinks. So over time, the species comes to look more like the organism that had the traits that allowed them to climb up in the trees and eat the fruit. All right? Okay. So that's it for this video talking about natural selection and its basic mechanisms. As always, if you have any questions, let me know. If not, I hope you have a great one, and I'll see you next time.